Look, I just want to talk about today. I'm a psychiatrist who often has to assess terrorism suspects. And even though I don't live in Toronto, I've been very interested in some of the discussions there. Now, most of you will be familiar with the events. Faisal Hussein, young man who's committed a murder. It's unclear what motives are, but certainly some questions. Some people, some media outlets have reported that he may have pledged allegiance to ISIS, visited Afghanistan, Pakistan. So look, this is a common debate we have around terrorism. Australia had a similar debate a couple of years ago when the guy Manhoran Monis, he basically took people hostage and ended up, 2 people died as well as himself. And given he had a prior history of mental illness, this whole debate goes on about he's mentally ill, therefore it's got nothing to do with Islam, etc. And I really wanted to speak to that. So just some big points. So one, just because you're mentally ill doesn't mean it doesn't have anything to do with Islam, like a terrorist act. Because those who are mentally ill are still likely to latch on to ideas of the moment. They might, and they're more likely to be violent on occasions. So I just want to touch on that. So for example, what are the types of mental illness most likely to lead to terrorism? So one is if you have any sort of paranoid predisposition. So for example, if you have schizophrenia, which is a serious mental illness, yes, you're more likely to latch onto ideas around conspiracy theories or other types of threats. And they are often culturally determined. So whatever sort of things are happening at the time are what people with schizophrenia might latch onto. So for example, 100 years ago, it might have been all about, Jesus or the Nazis or whatever it might be. Whereas in the last few decades, for example, I've had patients who think they're on reality TV. And likewise, you may get some who latch onto ideas around terrorism, etc. So that's one. And I guess that group, when they have serious mental illness, you could argue that the biggest cause is the mental illness, not ideas around terrorism. So that's one. But the wider group is what we might call personality disorders. And you might have heard of this, people who will say narcissists or antisocial, paranoid personalities. And that is much more closely attuned to what happens in terrorism. So it's often people who, I guess, aren't the best adjusted people. And yes, they're more likely to be prone to projecting. So any problems or distress they feel, they'll think it's the fault of the outside world. They're more likely to get paranoid, think people have, negative intentions towards them. They're more likely to get resentful. I often talk about terrorism being a conflation, a kind of link between personal resentments with political resentment, which is the ideology of Islam. Those sort of things are important. So for example, when I see people in jail, a typical scenario is they've had an antisocial background. So they might have committed crimes, they got trouble at school, and they also tend to have black and white thinking. They're not good at seeing balanced ideas. Everything's has to be this, good, bad. And they're also the types of people that are more likely to latch on extremist ideas of any kind, including Islamism. Lots of people who've actually committed terrorist acts have been out of jail and had a history of violence, and then they converted to Islam. And this is certainly the case in the Paris bombings and many others. So they already had a tendency to be violent, but then you've mixed that in with this resentment ideology of Islamism, which kind of almost gives them an excuse. It basically allows them to enact violence. So they're more likely to latch onto these ideas. And in many ways, Islam is it's sort of the language of protest these days. And I think a lot of people convert to Islam. It's almost their way of kind of saying stuff you to the Western society, much like, some Muslims who are very religious. For them too, it can be something of a middle finger to Western society. So it can be an act of protest. So certain personality types and certain serious mental illness already can overlap with people who are more likely to commit terrorism offences. Now, some people say, well, that tells us it's got nothing to do with Islam. Well, that's where I say it's wrong. Just because you're mentally ill, yes, certain people who are mentally ill or a bit off key, they're always going to be the one who are more likely to engage in deviant behaviour, namely violence, or here in this case, I guess, politically motivated violence. But that doesn't mean those ideas aren't there. So lots of those ideas around, say, anti-Western ideas, or that Islam is threatened, or the caliphate, or you name it, all those kinds of ideas that can lead to terrorist acts. Those ideas, it's a sign that the ideas are filtering. They're part of the wider conversation, particularly around Muslim communities. And that's where this guy, again, I'm speculating, but in the event he's he had some element of mental illness, it may well be that latched onto some ideas surrounding terrorism. So if he's already paranoid, had some history of deviant behaviour, possibly violence, he's the sort of person much more likely to latch onto the ideas of terrorism and enact them. Now, that doesn't mean it's got nothing to do with Islam. It does. It also doesn't mean it's got nothing to do with mental illness. So they can exist as both. So much more nuanced than both people, some people on the left and the right might argue. I hope that helps. If you like that video, subscribe to Rebel Media.